Who was Ned Kelly? Was there a police conspiracy to ruin his family? Where did his insane suit of armor come from? And what the heck happened to his skull? Ned Kelly is undeniably one of, if not the most famous Australian criminal to have ever lived. While many think of him as nothing more than a cop-killing villain, others see him as a kind of folk hero fighting against his oppressors. And to this day, I would dare you to point me to any Australian criminal that's a fraction as controversial as Ned Kelly. So today, I'll be covering the full story of Ned Kelly's life and criminal career, including what set him down a path contrary to the law. I'll also be covering many notable details of his particular brand of crime that made him so divisive, such as the Gerald Derry letter and his iconic final battle with the police. Now, keep in mind, this is my own telling of Ned Kelly's story. I highly encourage you to research this story for yourself and to form your own opinion about the legendary tale of Australia's last bushranger. So to really understand Ned Kelly's story, I think you first have to dive into a bit of his background. Ned's father, John Kelly, was born in Clonbrogan, Moyglas, Ireland in 1820. For 20 years, he lived a relatively undocumented life. But in 1840, he would be accused and found guilty of stealing 2 pigs and aiding in the theft of an additional 7 cows. At the time, Ireland was experiencing widespread famine, and it was hard to throw a rock without some starving child mistaking it for a piece of bread. And while we can't say that starvation was why John Kelly took to thievery, we can reasonably conclude that he was, in fact, a hungry boy. This earned him a reputation as a livestock thief that, unfortunately, would follow him for the rest of his life. Now, at this time, it was still common practice to toss criminals on a boat and send them south. Not like South Ireland, but like way south, all the way to Australia. So basically, this is a story all about how John Kelly's life got flipped, turned upside down. And he'd like to take a minute, just sit right there, and he'll tell you how he became a starving farmer in Australia. Now, maybe that version of the song needs some work, but so did John Kelly now that he had arrived in a new land. So for the next couple of years, he worked as a carpenter until he met Ellen Quinn in 1850, whom he would later marry that same year. He supported her by dealing horses, dairy farming, and engaging in the totally safe, not risky at all business of gold mining, and I'll let you guess how that turned out. It turned out poorly. It turned out really poorly for him. In any case, they would continue like this for 14 years, having 7 children during that time. One of their sons, Edward, decided that his name wasn't cool enough for him, and so he shortened it to Ned. That's not in the historical records. I just like to imagine that Ned Kelly was pointlessly rebellious at a young age. The historical records do suggest that he would later become rebellious because, yes, this is that Ned Kelly. You know, the one from the beginning of the video. John Kelly would also decide to be rebellious by, not starving to death. At least, that's how the police saw it when he fed his family with a neighbor's cow that wandered near his home. Because of this incident, he reestablished his identity as a livestock thief, and worse than that, spread that reputation to his family. He would end up spending 4 months in prison to avoid a fine that he couldn't afford to pay. Less than a year later, in 1866, John Kelly would be diagnosed with edema, which I definitely would not recommend looking up because it's pretty gross and it looks really painful. Then, less than a month after falling ill, John Kelly would die, leaving his son Ned the head of their household. So anyway, Ned Kelly, along with his mother Ellen and his siblings, moved into a hut on the property of James Quinn, Ellen's father. A few years later, at the age of 16, Ned would be arrested after allegedly assaulting a Chinese man. However, Ned would be acquitted of these charges due to some help from some friends, one of whom may have been Alex Fitzpatrick, who was himself a young police officer. Ned apparently hadn't had enough because he got arrested again in 1870 under suspicion of connection to known criminal and bushranger Harry Power, a man whose name clearly had an influence on Ned's fashion sense. However, these charges too would be dismissed. But this time it seemed that the police were still suspicious of Ned, and his repeated arrests seemed to have damaged his kinship with Alex Fitzpatrick. Many years later, in 1877, Ned would decide to go out drinking with Alex and a few other friends. Late into the evening, Ned realized that he had had too much to drink, so he mounted his horse and started to ride back towards the Kelly house. However, he was stopped by his friend Fitzpatrick. As I'm sure we're all aware, buzzed horseback riding is drunk horseback riding. So, Ned was hauled away to jail for the night by somebody who he considered to be a friend. Fitzpatrick would insist that Ned be handcuffed for his trip to the courthouse the following morning. Of course, Kelly decided to bolt as soon as he saw an opening, so it's hard to say that Fitzpatrick wasn't justified in suggesting the handcuffs. As Ned ran, Fitzpatrick tried to stop him by grabbing at his boots to trip him, but instead he simply ripped the sole off the boot and got kicked in the face. Another officer named Lonigan reached higher in an attempt to stop Kelly, grabbing him firmly by the nethers. Hey, at least it didn't end up like his boot, though. Kelly would finally stop resisting arrest when William McGinnis, the local flour miller and justice of the peace, stepped in to help. Weird job combination. Yep, I make what you break your bread with, and also I sentence people to death. I believe this was a key moment that caused Ned Kelly to turn his back on the police. In spite of his previous imprisonments, he had continued to be friends with Fitzpatrick for years. This imprisonment was different because, unlike his other run-ins with the law, this time it was coming from his own friend. In Ned's eyes, this wasn't justice, this was betrayal. So perhaps in an attempt to avoid the police from then on out, Ned decided that it was a good idea to get an honest job. So he began working in timber getting, and actually managed to stick with it for a couple of years. However, during this time, his mother would get remarried to a man named George King, who, like all Australians in the 1800s, apparently, was a horse thief. Seriously, like, everyone connected with the Kellys seemed to be stealing something with 4 legs and a snout. And, despite his best efforts, Ned Kelly would once again get drawn back into the old stallion snatching game. According to Kelly, one of his stepfather's horses had been taken by police and given to a man named James Whitty, a rich landowner and horse trader in the area. On several occasions, Whitty would accuse Kelly of livestock theft, but would often later deny that he had done so. I don't think it's clear from the documents we have whether or not he was really reporting this or if the police were just making it up, but Kelly does admit to stealing over 400 horses from James Whitty. He believed it to be justified since Whitty was impounding and basically holding the horses of poorer farmers. I think that this specific point is where a lot of the comparisons between Ned Kelly and Robin Hood come from. It's that whole dynamic of he's stealing from the rich to give back to the poor. But whether or not that's actually true kind of depends on which account you prefer, Ned Kelly's or the police. See, Ned and both of his brothers would have a hard time with the law during their lives. James, the middle Kelly boy, would spend a total of 14 years in prison for livestock theft. And for the rest of this story, he actually spends all of his time in prison, so he just doesn't have any part of it. Now, Daniel, the youngest brother, was only ever arrested for property damage, but he was also accused of horse theft. And that's where the story of Ned Kelly really starts to take off. With a warrant out for young Dan, it was only a matter of time before police came knocking. One afternoon in April, Alex Fitzpatrick would show up on the Kellys' doorstep looking to find Dan. Since he had, at one time, been a friend of Ned's, he was welcomed inside, where he found Ellen Kelly and her daughter Kate. As I mentioned, James Kelly was away in prison, and Dan was just kind of out and about at this time. So, Ellen invited Alex to just sit and chat for a while he waited for Dan to show up. And before too long, Dan arrived back home. Now, Alex was oddly peaceful about the whole situation. Like, when Dan first showed up, he was just like, "Hey, do you mind if I eat before we go?" And Alex was like, "Sure, that's cool with me." But before Dan could finish his meal, things would escalate pretty rapidly. Ned Kelly, realizing that his only other brother was about to be taken away and thrown in prison, decided that he liked shooting people even more than stealing horses. So he burst through the door and shot Fitzpatrick in the wrist. At least, that's Fitzpatrick's account. As I mentioned, a lot of this is really up to whether or not you prefer the police records or Ned Kelly's retelling. According to Kelly, he wasn't even present that day, and this entire story was simply a fabrication by Fitzpatrick. In any case, the police accused Ellen Kelly, her son-in-law William Skillion, and their neighbor William Williamson of attempting to murder Fitzpatrick. And I'd like to repeat, Ellen Kelly, William Skillion, and William Williamson, because that is the most ridiculous collection of names I have ever heard. William Skillion. I read William Skillion like a week ago, and I still just think about it and laugh. So, with his mother in custody and a bounty of 100 pounds out on both of their heads, Ned and Dan just took off into the Australian bush. They had officially had enough. But, I mean, not like officially, they didn't like submit paperwork or anything, but I mean, they were pretty ticked. They were also joined by 2 other men by the names of Joe Byrne and Steve Hart. They had another friend named Aaron Sherritt who didn't join them, but he decided to support them by teaching them how to mine gold. They tried to convince Aaron to run away with them, but he decided that he wanted to just live a safer life with his family, which, I mean, understandable. That might all sound a bit random, but it comes back up later in the story. These 4 men together formed the Kelly gang. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Ned had been arrested under suspicion of being connected with a man named Harry Power. Well, even though those charges were dismissed, historians pretty widely agree that Harry Power actually was Ned's mentor. From the time that Ned turned 16, Power allowed the boy to join him in the bush for robberies. When the police originally arrested Ned, they may have actually been trying to get him to rat out Powers in exchange for a shorter sentence, but they were ultimately unsuccessful. Regardless, Harry had a major impact on Ned's capabilities and his unique brand of crime. He taught him how to be a bushranger. But odds are, if you're from anywhere other than Australia, you're probably thinking, what the heck is a bushranger? Basically, a bushranger is a criminal who hides out in the Australian wilderness. They were masters of using the environment around them to hide out and ambush their victims. Some bushrangers, such as Power himself, were merciful and humane towards their victims, opting not to kill. Others were not the least bit afraid to use violence to achieve their goals. Ned ended up falling kind of somewhere in the middle, because while he wasn't afraid to defend himself, by his own telling, he would go to great lengths to spare those that he could. So, in an attempt to find the runaways, the police sent 4 officers into the bush. Their names were McIntyre, Scanlon, Kennedy, and there was one other that Ned knew quite well, Lonigan. One night, the 4 officers set up camp in the bush as a reprieve from their search. Meanwhile, Ned, under cover of night, would find them and begin to plot his next move. At this point, I believe the police were looking for a couple of regular troublemakers, not hardened killers. I don't know if they were even aware that the boys weren't alone anymore, and I definitely don't think they were prepared for the Kelly gang to resort to extreme violence in order to escape, even if the officers themselves planned to shoot the brothers if necessary. After all, the Kellys had never been especially violent. Even if Fitzpatrick's story about Ned shooting him in the wrist was to be believed, Ned had only fired to wound him, not to kill him. The following morning, Ned Kelly and his brother returned to the camp to find that the officers had split up. 2 stayed behind at the camp, and 2 had gone out on patrol. Together, Ned and his brother descended silently upon the camp. They carefully waited for the officers to distance themselves from their firearms. As Dan kept his sights trained on McIntyre, Ned closed in until he was close enough to keep the men under control. Calling out for the men to surrender, Ned watched for their reactions. While McIntyre quickly complied, Lonigan rushed for cover and reached for his weapon. Fumbling with his revolver, he attempted to peek out from behind the log so that he could take a shot and end Ned Kelly once and for all. But he was too slow. With a shot from Ned's rifle, Lonigan's lifeless body slumped to the ground. McIntyre, the other officer, watched his friend die and resolved not to act, a choice which would save McIntyre's life. Ned appealed to the officer, explaining that he and his brother were innocent and that Fitzpatrick had simply fabricated the story about them. Meanwhile, far away, Scanlon and Kennedy, the 2 patrolling officers, heard gunshots coming from the direction of the camp. As quickly as the 2 men could maneuver through the bush, they rushed back to their allies. Upon arrival, they found McIntyre apprehended and Lonigan dead. McIntyre pled with them to turn around and leave, and if they agreed to leave the police forever, the outlaw would spare their lives. Scanlon and Kennedy considered their options and then asked Ned if what McIntyre said was true. Affirming the truth of it, Kelly told the men that he would give them a chance for freedom. The officers spurred their horses into a gallop and bolted away from the campsite, until Scanlon, in one smooth motion, turned back, drew his rifle, and fired off a shot at Ned. Kennedy, seeing his opening, leapt from his horse and dove behind a tree. He drew his firearm as well and took aim at the criminals. Shots rang out, a cacophony in the midst of the wilderness. In the blink of an eye, Scanlon had readied another shot and took aim for the heart of the oldest Kelly boy. But Ned was even faster. With one pull of the trigger, he sent a portion of lead screaming through the air and into Scanlon's vitals, dethroning him from his horse. The man was dead before he hit the ground. As he fell several feet to the ground and hit the earth with a thud, McIntyre rushed for Kennedy's horse, hopped on, and galloped away from the firefight. For a moment, Ned considered shooting the man in the back, but he remained true to his word and let the man go free. Left with no means of escape, Kennedy would be overwhelmed with gunfire and gravely injured. As the officer weakly attempted to escape, Ned Kelly followed. Ned felt a twinge of remorse. He hadn't wanted to kill these men, but this encounter only confirmed his belief that the police were irredeemable. Knowing that Kennedy had already been mortally wounded, Ned took aim at the man's back as a mercy and fired a shot through his heart, putting an end to the officer's life as well as to the life that Ned Kelly once had. He covered Kennedy with a cloak and left the body in as honorable a way as he could, citing that he could not have been more regretful had Scanlon and Kennedy been his own brothers. All the while, he was quietly reflecting on the satisfaction of seeing Lonigan's body fall limp, recalling his brawl with Lonigan and Fitzpatrick years earlier. Ned returned to Lonigan's motionless figure and pried the revolver from his cold hands, making a half effort to wipe the blood from its frame. He looked up to see his brother gathering firearms from the other men, hoping to give themselves every chance that they could get against the other officers that would inevitably come for them. From this point on, every member of the Kelly gang gave up their old lives. There would be no more years spent in and out of jail. The stakes of capture had never been higher. From here on, there was only freedom or death. So, this story is so much longer than I expected it to be. I have the rest of the script totally finished. I just am splitting it up into multiple parts so that it's more digestible for viewers. If the next part is out, it's going to be right here. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.